Hey guys, today we're talking about recognizing blind spots, and I have 3 questions for you to ask yourself to determine if you are dealing with a blind spot. I'm Emily Goldthwait, I'm an author and energy healer, and I help people have powerful self-awareness, deep self-compassion, and expanded understanding. A blind spot is a subconscious belief pattern or wounding that has not been healed that is generating a repeating outcome in your life, and you do not know you have a blind spot. That's why it's called a blind spot. The very nature of it is that you don't realize you have it, but it is affecting your life. So my tips today are going to help you determine whether or not it's a blind spot you're dealing with, and also give you a few tools and ideas of how to dissect this blind spot so that you can get an idea of what it's about. Because the nature of blind spots is we don't know what they are, and we don't even know what they're about because it's either blocked or it's in our subconscious, or it was so far back that we just don't remember it. So when we have the blind spots, we don't even know what's there to address. So my tips today will help you kind of figure out what you're dealing with so that you can take it to your healer, your therapist, whoever it is, and know and understand kind of what angle to come at this from. So tip number 1 is, has this type of thing ever happened to you before? So when you catch yourself saying like, oh my gosh, this is exactly like when blank happened. Or when blank, blank, and blank happened, right? Sometimes there's a lot of repeating times. When you catch yourself saying, wow, this is exactly like when, or exactly like who, exactly like so-and-so, you're going to realize that somewhere in there you have a repeating pattern going on, whether it's the type of people you're attracting to yourself, or it's an experience that you keep regenerating for yourself. Most likely, that's going to be hung up on some sort of a blind spot, like a wounding that is still signaling that it's there until you resolve it. So once you catch yourself saying, oh my gosh, this has happened before, and you recognize that pattern, then you're going to want to go and write down all of their similarities as well as their differences, if you can detect any, to see what the pattern is. What is the same thing that's creating this over and over again? What are the elements of that event, that relationship, that dynamic that is reoccurring for you? Whether it's like, oh, I always recreate this kind of a relationship, or I always attract this kind of people, or I always have this kind of experience when I perform, or whatever it is. Write down the similarities of what happens, both how you feel about it, how you think about it, traits, and just anything that you can catch that's in common, and write those things down. Once you've compiled a really thorough list of this, you're going to be able to look at it a little more objectively and see what things those patterns revolve around. What exactly is the common trait and thread between all of these that ties them all together? And if you can identify that, then you can kind of look at whatever that is and start asking yourself, what's the earliest experience that I can remember or think of that has to do with this thing? And if it's with relationships, understand that our most formative and our primary relationship was with our parents. So that's going to be one of the first places you want to look at is, what were the relationship with my parents? What were their relationship with each other? And what was their relationship with me as the entity of mom and dad to me? And see if anything in there sounds similar to this pattern that you have going on. Because then that's going to be what you can take to your therapist, your healer, and be like, okay, here is what I see in, my dynamic with my parents, or their dynamic with each other. Here's what I've got going on. And clearly there's a correlation here because it's the same thing happening over again. Or let's say you've identified something like stage fright, and you're like, okay, when was the very first time I felt that I was performing, whether it was on a stage or maybe another scenario, or maybe a conversation that was said about like judgment that would come if you performed. Like, you can detect and identify what the common thread is. Then you can go back and say, okay, what experiences or belief systems do I have about that thing that might be generating this repeating pattern here? So number 2 is polar opposites. When you catch yourself in a polar opposite scenario or relationship, that's going to signal you that it is 2 sides of the same coin, and you're having a flip side conversation, which means somewhere in between that little sandwich is your blind spot, okay? So when we have a negative repeating pattern, or a negative way of being, or negative experiences, sometimes what we'll do to try and break out of it is we do the exact opposite. We just like flip 100% around to the other side, and we do the exact opposite. and it'll look very, very much in exact contrast with itself, okay? And what that means is whatever the wounding was that had you stuck in the first place, it's gonna have you stuck in the second place. Both are gonna feel dysfunctional, and you'll be able to see and like, I didn't like that, but I didn't like this either. And in fact, they're totally opposite. So how do I find that middle ground? Well, that middle ground is actually gonna be whatever the wounding or belief system is that caused the first one. It's also causing your second one. It's just the reverse side of it. So we call that a flip side conversation, or the other side of the coin. And both of them are actually tied together. So once you see that you're having a polar opposite experience, you're gonna wanna go and be like, okay, what's the results of both of these? Like I said, whether it's a relationship or experience, what is the outcome of it? And what do they have in common? Because they look so polar, different, opposite, but you are going to find something in common, and that common center ground is going to be where your wounding is or your blind spot is, that you can then start to dissect. Step number 3 is what I call detective strings. Okay, so this one I had a lot of experience with. It was one of my first ones identifying a really big blind spot that I had. And I would have all these triggers and reactions that I could tell were exaggerated for what the events were. I would have a very strong reaction, and I had a lot of phobias, and I had a lot of hangups and insecurities and all these things, and they all just seemed really, for one, overwhelming. Like, how am I ever going to sift through all these and figure out what the heck is going on here and why I have all of this stuff, right? But when I started looking at what could cause these things, what kinds of things generate this kind of dysfunction or this kind of trigger or this kind of insecurity, what would be the root of that? I felt like, if you've ever seen those detective shows where they have their pin board and they wrap the string and they oh, well, that goes here and this goes here and this goes there. And they start to figure out what's at the center of their mystery. That's what it was like for me. I called it my invisible elephant in the room, because as I started doing that, I realized that all of my triggers were kind of pointing back to the same horizon event or events, but I had zero memory of any kind of event like that happening in my life. And so I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense. You'd think I'd remember something that traumatic, but the fact remained that nothing made sense unless that was at the center of all these little strings I had going on. I didn't make sense as a person if that wasn't there. And so I started noting and keeping track, not writing it down this time, but just keeping track in my mind of okay, what was my trigger this time? And how do I feel inside? And what is my trigger really about? What's the conversation going on inside? What are my thought patterns here? What am I saying to myself about this? And as I started doing that, that's when I started seeing all of those strings coming together. So pretty soon I had pretty solid evidence that there was my invisible elephant in the center. And my breakthrough came one day when I was watching a little YouTube video, and it was about, something that went on that really shouldn't have, but it wasn't necessarily really, really bad. But my reaction was over the top. I was like, kids, here's a movie for you. Mommy's got to go deal with this, right? And so I went in my room while they're watching their movie, and I am livid, and I am so overwhelming, angry, rageful, upset, crying. I can't stop this trigger that's going on for me. And I looked at myself in the mirror and I was like, this isn't a normal reaction to that. Yeah, it's one thing to be mad about the video and maybe oh, disgusted by it or whatever. But my reaction to it was whoa, there's something big here. There's something here to this. And for me, when I had that moment and I looked at myself in the mirror and I could just see what was going through me, that's when I realized, okay, it's time to accept that my invisible elephant in the room is something. Even if it's not exactly what I think it is, there is something there. And once I accepted that and I went to God and I spiritually went internalized, and I was like, okay, I accept that outcome, that possibility in my past probably happened. If that is correct, help me to start seeing it more clearly. And it took me probably close to a year of just coming back to that acceptance of, I accept that what I think is that invisible elephant in my room probably is invisible elephant in my room, and I accept that, and I accept that I don't remember it, but that it's there all the same and it's real all the same, and help me to know what to do with this. And as I did that and I practiced, self-love, self-compassion, and self-forgiveness, memories started coming back that was like snatches of like, oh, I was right. That invisible elephant is there. And I started being able to work on that and heal it. But first it took me accepting that my detective work, all of my strings meant something, that they actually pointed the right direction. And that once you start to accept that maybe things weren't as wonderful as you'd hoped they would have been, then you can start to acknowledge reality to yourself. So one of the things that happens with our mind is that when something traumatic or bad happens to us, especially when we're very young, sometimes we throw like this cloak of invisibility over it, right? So that we can live our life and not have to always be aware that that trauma or that hard thing is there because we aren't ready to deal with it or capable to deal with it as a child. And so we'll throw that over it. And then, we live our life and we have all these dysfunctions because we have this, massive elephant in the room, and we're trying to live and work our life around it without addressing it because we don't remember it's there. It's cloaked from us. It's our blind spot. We can't see it. Another way that it can be a blind spot for you is that sometimes when things are presented or presumed to be normal, particularly when we're young and formative and trying to figure out what normal is, if our mind registers something as a normal event or behavior or activity, it's not going to take as much note of it. Our fight or flight brain is to protect us. And so when there's something negative or scary, that instantly gets internalized in our memories because it's protecting us, versus a positive experience. It takes a lot more times of that positive experience to be remembered. And so if something's very shocking, traumatic, we'll either block it or we'll remember it very, very well to try and stay safe. So if something is perceived by us to be normal, especially if you have a repeating occurrence of trauma, you're going to normalize it in your mindset, and it's going to be harder to remember that it's there because you can't see it because it looks normal to you, if that makes sense. So one way to detect that is going to be like, hey, I have all these triggers. Hey, I have all these insecurities, and they all point to this. What back in the day maybe is not quite as normal as I thought it was, and start looking at, was there ever any moments that I felt odd about something that doesn't add up now? So there's a lot of different ways to come at this, and that's pretty deep trauma work, especially depending on what's there for you versus just like, oh, I got on stage and I froze. If it's like true trauma, you're going to be wanting to work with a healer or a therapist or somebody that can help you ground and center, because once you start finding your elephant, if it's that hidden from you, it's going to be pretty dramatic when it comes up, and you're going to have a lot of strong emotions because it's something that you haven't known and kept from yourself for a very long time. So just make sure that when you're doing the deep trauma work, you're safe, and that you have your healers lined up and ready to go and working with you and helping you dissect this. But for me, that was my starting point when I was able to convince myself to go see a healer for that, because at first I was like, well, I don't have anything to say. I'm just a very weird person with all these triggers. But once I was able to go, okay, I'm pretty solid that there's something there. It's time to go see a healer. And then I went to my healer and it was like, yeah, you got some stuff here, girl. So if that helps you, which I hope it does, just, start playing detective. Start trying to see how all these little things that maybe seem so random for you might add up and match together so that you can see and find that blind spot and realize that there is something there to work on. So to reiterate, step number 1 is to ask yourself, has this ever happened before, right? If it's a repeating pattern, go write it down. Start noting what the pattern is. Step number 2 is going to be polar opposites. Flip side conversations, 2 sides of the same coin. If you were doing this and now suddenly you're doing this and they're totally opposite, see what they have in common so that you can find what's at the center, at the epicenter of that pattern. Step number 3 is going to be playing detective with the little detective strings, where you note your triggers, you note your hangups, your insecurities, and see if they tie together somehow, if there's some sort of event that might have generated those. So that's it for today. I hope you found that helpful. If you did, go ahead and give it a like for me, and also subscribe to my channel. And feel free to share it with other people, because that would be awesome. Every week I'm going to be putting out content like this to help people like you have light, love, and joy in your journey. Take care.